At the end of this long series of polarizing events of the 1850s is the event that finally pushed the nation into civil war, and that was the election of 1860. The candidates were Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. The Democratic Party obviously had split into two. They each nominated a separate candidate. Um, Breckinridge was a strong defender of slavery. He was the candidate of the Deep South. Douglas was still trying to push popular sovereignty and not really pleasing anybody very much, although he got a fair number of votes in the North, fewer votes in the South. John Bell wanted to keep the Union together. He wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific and somehow keep the Union together. But in the spirit of polarization between North and South, he didn't appeal to a very wide audience. He did win some states in the upper South, most importantly Virginia. And then finally, Abraham Lincoln was the Republican. He was against the expansion of slavery to the territories, period. Lincoln won the election with no Southern support, and that goes a long way to explain why the Civil War happened when it did. The South now did not believe that it could control its own future anymore. In 10 slave states, he was not even on the ballot. He was in Virginia, where he got 1% of the vote. So the South decided that they had no more hope through the political process. You can look at the electoral map from 1860 on the PDF, perhaps more carefully, and understand what happened and why. You'll notice that Stephen Douglas only won 12 electoral votes. The votes of Missouri and New Jersey, 3 of New Jersey's votes, New Jersey split its electoral votes. But he finished second in the popular vote. He got almost 1.4 million votes, but he got most of those votes in northern states, where he lost almost every one of them to Abraham Lincoln. You can see Breckinridge wins the great bulk of the southern states. Bell wins the border states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and Lincoln sweeps the North. Compared to 1856, Lincoln did much better than John C. Fremont. He won Pennsylvania, he won Indiana, he won Illinois, and some votes from New Jersey, and that was enough to give him the presidency. Now, polarization in voting is very obvious this year. In Massachusetts, Lincoln won by a huge landslide, 106,000 to 34,000 for Douglas. Breckinridge only got 6,000 votes. But in Mississippi, he won the election by a landslide. Lincoln got no votes. In Virginia, Bell won a very close race with Breckinridge. Douglas trailed very far behind, and Lincoln got 1,800 votes out of almost 170,000 cast. We're resuming. Windows again is being a little bit balky. After the election of Lincoln, the process of secession began, southern states leaving the Union. He was elected in 1860, in November of 1860. A month and a half later, on December 20th, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 6 days later, the day after Christmas, they laid siege to Fort Sumter, a Union fort in Charleston Harbor. Then, in the next 2 months, 6 more deep southern states seceded. You can see the names listed here. President Buchanan talked a good game, but did nothing. He was weak and ineffective. he is commonly rated as the worst or one of the worst presidents in American history. Lincoln, although he was elected in November, was not inaugurated until March 4th. So when he came to the presidency, 7 states had already seceded from the Union, left the Union. So 8 of the 15 states were still in the Union when Lincoln became president. And it was a major part of his challenge early in his presidency to try to keep at least some of them. He felt that if he lost them all, he could not win a civil war. Now, Lincoln's overwhelming goal, his top priority, was to save the Union. Secondly, he insisted on stopping the expansion of slavery to the territories. Now, personally, he had been long exposed to slavery, but he believed that the above goals had to come before ending slavery. So he said, we have to save the Union, and he was even willing to compromise on slavery where it already existed if he could save the Union. He thought that slavery would die out on its own, possibly by the year 1950, which is amazing when we look at it today. When he was inaugurated, he was faced with a very difficult problem. He had to take back control of Fort Sumter. He did not feel that he could afford to lose all of the slave states, however. So he even offered in his inaugural address to support a constitutional amendment that would do 2 things. It would protect slavery where it existed already, but it would ban its use elsewhere. The South refused. They were not about to trust Lincoln, to say the least. You can see where the deep South, the slaves were located in greatest numbers, and these deep southern states in the Cotton Belt were the first ones to secede from the Union. You look at South Carolina, for example, what a huge concentration of slaves were there. The argument that this was about about states' rights was simply not true. The South's decision to secede was about slavery, and they say that in their the laws that they passed, the ordinances of secession, in which they leave the Union. This is an important map. You need to know it. The red states are the first 7 states to secede. The pink states are those who seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter. And these light green states are slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that did not leave the Union. They remained in the Union. Now, when Fort Sumter was under siege, Lincoln had 3 options. He could abandon it, just let it go. He wasn't willing to do that because it was a United States fort, and that would suggest weakness. He could attack Southerners there, but he didn't want to do that because he was afraid that that would drive other slave states out of the Union. He chose option 3, to resupply the fort with non-military materials, especially food, and to force the South to fire the first shot. Lincoln did not want to be the aggressor. And of course, the reason was to keep more slave states from seceding from the Union. On April 12, 1861, with a supply ship on its way to resupply Fort Sumter, the South, or the Southern militia in South Carolina, gave an ultimatum, an either-or choice, to the commandant of Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson. They said either surrender by 4 a.m. on April 12th or we will attack. Anderson refused to surrender, and one of his former students at West Point, Pierre Beauregard, commanded the South Carolina troops, and they began shelling Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning, April 12th, 1861. That's when the Civil War began. After 34 hours, Fort Sumter surrendered. There were no casualties except for a Confederate horse. That would be the only battle I'm aware of in which there were no casualties in the Civil War. Now, Virginia was the critical state after this point. At first, they did not want to secede from the Union, but they warned Lincoln that he had to keep his hands off southern states, that they had to be free to go. Lincoln was unwilling to do this. He did not believe that they had the constitutional right to secede from the Union. So he called for 75,000 volunteer troops 2 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter. 2 days after that, Virginia seceded. It was followed by 3 other states that were waiting to see what Virginia would do. So shortly thereafter, in May of 1861, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded from the Union. Now that left these 4 states who remained in the Union, even though they allowed slavery. In addition, the northwestern counties of Virginia seceded from the state of Virginia. They said, well, 2 can play this game of secession. So they didn't support, the Confederacy in the Civil War. So they left the state of Virginia and then were later admitted by Congress to the Union as the state of West Virginia. Now, why do they do this? Well, first of all, they didn't have any slaves there at all. This is very hilly or mountainous territory. Slavery doesn't do well there. And the poor farmers there, or poor residents, hated the elite planters on the coast of Virginia. And they were not willing to spill their blood to defend the wealth and the slaves of people that they hated. Now, let's be clear, though, even though they were against secession and against these elite planters, they were not supporters of the slaves. They were pro-Union, but they were also highly racist, as many in the North were, all through the North. And this raises an important point that we'll see when we discuss the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln feared secession if he made the war a campaign against slavery. So he's got to be careful. He makes it clear that this is a war to preserve the Union. If he had said this is a war to end slavery, he probably would have lost these slave states in the North and perhaps lost the Civil War. And once again, these are the various categories of states during the war: the Deep South, the Upper South, who finally seceded, and then the 4 states, and now 5 states when you count West Virginia, who allowed slavery, but were still loyal to the Union. And then, of course, the Green states are in the North. Kansas, where there was all the fighting after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was now part of the Union as a free state in 1861 because the South had left, and Congress, dominated by Northerners, could do pretty much whatever it wanted.